Why do major life changes often feel confusing before they make sense? It's a question most people have encountered at some point, whether they realized it at the time or not. A relationship ends, a career changes, a belief system shifts, a chapter of life closes. And suddenly, something feels different. Not necessarily wrong, not necessarily right, just different. The things that once felt familiar no longer fit quite the same way. The routines feel different, the assumptions feel different, and even the story you've been telling yourself about who you are can begin to feel less certain. And what's strange is that these periods are often difficult to explain while they're happening. Looking back years later, people frequently describe those moments as turning points, necessary transitions, important periods of growth. But while they're inside of them, the experience often feels much less clear, more confusing, more uncertain, more unfinished. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness, not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. Which raises an interesting question. Why? Why do some of the most important transitions in human life feel so disorienting while we're moving through them? Because if transformation is leading somewhere meaningful, shouldn't it kind of feel more obvious? Shouldn't growth feel like progress? Shouldn't change feel like clarity? And yet many people report the opposite. The old story no longer seems to fit, and the new story hasn't arrived yet. And for a while, they find themselves standing somewhere in between. Not where they were, not yet where they're going, just between. And maybe that's why so many cultures develop stories about thresholds, doorways, crossroads, bridges, boundaries. Places that are neither one thing nor another. Because humans seem to recognize that some of the most important moments in life happen in these in-between spaces. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the crossing itself. And perhaps that's where the trickster begins to appear again. Because throughout myths, stories, and traditions around the world, trickster figures seem strangely drawn to boundaries, to transitions, to places where categories stop working, to moments when old rules no longer fully apply and new rules have not yet fully emerged. Which may be why the trickster so often appears right before something changes, not after the transformation, before it. And maybe understanding that pattern begins with understanding the space between. And maybe that's the first thing worth noticing about transitions. Most people expect change to feel like movement. One thing ends, another thing begins. A clear sequence, a clear progression, a clear path forward. But many important transitions don't unfold that way. Instead, they often create a period of uncertainty. A period where the old identity no longer fits, but the new identity hasn't fully formed. A period where Old assumptions stop working, but new assumptions haven't arrived yet. A period where certainty becomes difficult to hold on to, and experience can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Because humans generally like stable categories. We like knowing who we are. We like knowing where we're going. We like knowing how things fit together. But transitions often disrupt those certainties. For a while, familiar answers stop answering the questions they're supposed to answer. Familiar structures stop providing the stability they once provided. And people can find themselves feeling suspended between worlds. Not because they're lost, but because they're crossing. Which is interesting because many cultures developed language for exactly this kind of experience. Anthropologists sometimes use the word liminal to describe these in-between states. The word comes from a Latin term meaning threshold, a doorway, a crossing point, a place between one condition and another. And what's fascinating is that liminal spaces appear almost everywhere. Initiation rituals, coming of age ceremonies, pilgrimages, periods of retreat, crossroads in myths, journeys through wilderness. Again and again, human beings seem to recognize that transformation often includes a period where the old structure has loosened, but the new structure has not yet solidified. A period that feels uncertain precisely because something is changing. And perhaps that's where many people become uncomfortable. Because uncertainty often feels like evidence that something has gone wrong. If we're confused, we assume we're failing. If we're uncertain, we assume we're lost. If we don't know what's happening, we assume that we're moving in the wrong direction. But what if that assumption isn't always true? What if some forms of uncertainty appear not because transformation has failed, but because transformation has already begun? Because if a person is genuinely crossing a threshold, confusion may not be the absence of movement. It may be evidence that movement is already underway. And perhaps that's why so many stories place unusual figures at the threshold: guides, messengers, shapeshifters, and tricksters. Figures who seem strangely comfortable in places where certainty begins to break down. Because the threshold itself is a place where ordinary categories stop behaving in the way that they normally do. And that's exactly where the next part of the story begins. And maybe that's where the real challenge of transformation begins. Because most people don't struggle with change after it's happened. They struggle with uncertainty while it's happening. The period where the old story no longer works, but the new story hasn't fully arrived. And that can be surprisingly difficult because humans naturally create narratives. We organize experiences into stories, we build identities, we develop expectations. We create explanations for who we are, what we believe, where we're going, and how the world works. These stories help us to navigate reality. They create a sense of continuity, a sense of direction, a sense of stability. But eventually, life has a habit of challenging them. A relationship ends, a career changes, a belief shifts, a loss occurs, a realization appears. And suddenly, the story that once explained everything no longer explains quite as much as it used to, which can feel deeply unsettling. Not necessarily because something is wrong, but because certainty itself has started to loosen. And that's where many people become uncomfortable, because uncertainty creates questions. Questions creates ambiguity, and ambiguity can feel like vulnerability. We no longer know exactly where we stand. We no longer know exactly what comes next. The categories that once felt stable begin to blur. And human beings generally prefer stable categories. We like knowing who we are. We like knowing what things mean. We like knowing what the boundaries are. But thresholds are places where boundaries become less clear. And perhaps that's why periods of transformation can feel so emotionally strange. Part of us is still attached to the old story. Part of us senses a new story emerging, and for a while, both stories exist at the same time. One is fading, the other forming. Neither feels comfortably solid, which can create the feeling that many people describe during major transitions. The feeling of being suspended, of standing in between worlds, of no longer being who you were, but not yet knowing who you're becoming. And maybe that's the hidden tension inside every threshold. Not simply that something is changing, but that identity itself is being reorganized. Because transformation rarely asks us to change one thing. More often, it asks us to change the story that holds those things together. And perhaps that's why thresholds feel uncomfortable. Not because movement has stopped, but because the old map is no longer accurate and the new map is still being drawn. Which is interesting because there is one archetypal figure who seems unusually comfortable in exactly that kind of environment. The figure who thrives when categories blur, when certainty loosens, when old structures stop making sense. The trickster. And maybe that's what makes the trickster such a fascinating figure. Because while many people experience thresholds as uncomfortable, the trickster often seems perfectly at home there. Again and again, trickster figures appear at boundaries, between worlds, between identities, between categories, between the familiar and the unknown. And what's interesting is that many tricksters seem unusually resistant to stable definitions. They change shape, they cross lines, they blur distinctions. They move between places that other figures treat as separate. Loki shifts form. Hermes travels between worlds. Coyote crosses boundaries. Anazi moves between roles. Again and again, trickster figures seem drawn towards places where ordinary rules become less certain, which may be because the trickster represents something deeper than disruption. The trickster represents movement, the ability to cross from one condition into another. The ability to move between categories rather than remain trapped inside them. And that's important because thresholds themselves are places where categories begin to loosen. Child and adult, student and teacher, single and partnered, believer and skeptic, who you were and who you're becoming. During transitions, those distinctions often become less clear. For a while, a person may find themselves inhabiting both identities at once. Not fully one, not fully the other. And that's exactly the kind of environment where trickster figures tend to appear. Not because the trickster causes the transition, but because the trickster understands something is about to transition. That certainty becomes more difficult to maintain when reality itself is changing. That old definitions eventually become too small. That categories sometimes need to loosen before something new can emerge. And maybe that's why so many trickster stories involve crossing forbidden boundaries. Not necessarily because boundaries are bad, but because boundaries sometimes outlive their usefulness. A rule that once served growth can eventually restrict it. An identity that once provided stability can eventually become a limitation. A story that once explained reality can eventually stop fitting reality altogether. And when that happens, something has to create movement. Something has to reopen possibility. Something has to stop beyond the edge of the familiar, which is often exactly where the trickster appears. Not simply to create chaos, not simply to expose contradiction, but to help create the conditions where transformation becomes possible. Because before something new can emerge, something old often has to become flexible enough to change. And perhaps that's the deeper relationship between tricksters and thresholds. Both exist at the edge of certainty. Both occupy the space between what was and what will be. Both remind us that transformation rarely begins with answers. More often, it begins when old questions stop working. And perhaps that's why threshold stories appear so consistently throughout human history. Because once you begin looking for them, they're almost impossible not to notice. Again and again, important transformations seem to begin with a crossing. A doorway, a bridge, a wilderness, a crossroads, a journey away from the familiar. Across cultures and traditions, people repeatedly created rituals and stories that acknowledged a simple reality. Before someone becomes something new, there is often a period where they are no longer what they were. Initiation ceremonies recognized it, coming of age rituals recognized it, pilgrimages recognized it, vision quests recognized it. Even many mythological journeys begin this way. A person leaves the familiar world and enters a place where ordinary rules no longer seem to apply. The old identity begins to loosen, and the old assumptions begin to loosen. And then the old story begins to loosen. And for a while, uncertainty becomes part of the process, which is interesting because modern people often assume uncertainty is something to eliminate as quickly as possible. But many traditional cultures seem to have approached it differently. Rather than treating the threshold as a problem, they treated it as a stage. Not necessarily part of transformation itself, not the destination, not the goal, but an important part of the crossing. And perhaps that's why so many transformation stories involve symbolic deaths and rebirths. Not necessarily physical death, but the ending of an identity. the ending of a role, the ending of a way of seeing. Because before something new can emerge, something old often has to be released. And that's rarely a comfortable process, which may be why so many traditions surrounded these transitions with symbols, rituals, guides, and stories. Not to remove the uncertainty, but to help people move through it. To remind them that uncertainty was not always evidence of failure. Sometimes it was evidence that transformation was underway. And perhaps that's the deeper pattern hidden inside these threshold traditions. The crossing itself matters. Not just where it begins and not just where it ends, but the space in between. Because that space is often where the old story loosens its grip and the new story begins to take shape. And maybe that's why the trickster appears there so often. Because the trickster is not simply a figure of disruption. The trickster is a figure of passage, a reminder that movement often looks messy while it's happening. A reminder that certainty and transformation frequently arrive together. And a reminder that becoming something new rarely feels complete while it's still unfolding. And maybe that's where one final distinction becomes important. Because if thresholds play a meaningful role in transformation, it would be easy to assume that every period of uncertainty is automatically a sign of growth. But reality is usually more complicated than that. Not every disruption creates transformation. Not every ending creates renewal. Not every period of confusion leads somewhere meaningful. And perhaps that's why discernment remains important. Because the goal isn't to romanticize uncertainty. The goal is not to assume that every difficult experience contains a hidden lesson. The goal is awareness. The willingness to honestly engage with what is happening rather than immediately deciding what it means. Because sometimes uncertainty is part of growth, and sometimes uncertainty is just uncertainty. Sometimes a threshold leads towards transformation, and sometimes a person needs rest, support, reflection, or change in direction. The experience itself does not automatically tell us which is which is why awareness matters, reflection matters, and discernment matters. Because the purpose of recognizing a threshold is not to force a meaning onto it. The purpose is to become more present to it, to notice what's changing, to notice what's loosening, and to notice what's emerging, without rushing to conclusions before the process has had time to unfold. And perhaps that's one of the most overlooked lessons hidden inside threshold stories. The crossing cannot always be rushed. The old story may need time to loosen. The new story may need time to form. And the space between may remain uncertain longer than we would prefer. But uncertainty itself is not necessarily evidence that something has gone wrong. Sometimes it's simply evidence that the outcome has not yet become visible. And maybe that's where the trickster offers one final lesson. Not certainty, not answers, but the willingness to remain curious while the path is still unfolding. Because sometimes the most important transformations are not only recognizable in hindsight, And sometimes the crossing makes sense only after you've reached the other side. So, why do major life changes often feel confusing before they make sense? Perhaps because transformation rarely announces itself clearly while it's happening. Instead, it often arrives as uncertainty, as ambiguity, as the feeling that something old is ending before something new has fully emerged. And throughout this episode, we've seen that pattern appear again and again in thresholds, in liminal spaces, in rites of passage, in myths, and in stories, and in the trickster itself. Again and again, humans seem to recognize that some of the most important moments in life occur between identities, between stories, between ways of understanding ourselves and the world around us. Not at the beginning and not at the end, but in the crossing. And perhaps that's why the experience can feel so distorting. Because part of us wants certainty. Part of us wants answers. Part of us wants to know exactly where the path leads before we take the next step. But thresholds rarely work that way. The old story loosens first. The new story forms later. And for a while, uncertainty becomes part of the process. Not necessarily because something has gone wrong, but because something is changing. And maybe that's the deeper lesson hidden inside the trickster. Not simply that certainty should be questioned, not simply that boundaries can be crossed, but that transformation often begins when certainty starts to loosen, where categories begin to blur, where old answers stop working, and where new possibilities have not fully appeared. Because often that's where growth begins. Not in the certainty that comes afterward, but in the uncertainty that comes before. And perhaps that's why trickster figures appear so often at thresholds. Not because they create transformation, but because they remind us that transformation is already underway. That movement is happening even when it doesn't yet make sense. That becoming something new often feels incomplete while it's still unfolding. And that sometimes the most important thing we can do is remain present long enough to see what emerges. Because the question isn't whether uncertainty belongs in the process. Maybe the question is whether we've mistaken uncertainty for failure. And perhaps that's the gift hidden inside the trickster after all. The reminder that confusion is not always evidence that you're lost. Sometimes it's evidence that you're crossing. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week when we talk about spiritual teachers, where we ask, what were they really teaching? And are they really that different from each other? I'll see you there.